modern world, there has always been a winner. Always. From the Dutch Golden Age to the British Industrial Empire to the American century we're still living in. Global economics has never been a shared game. It's been a chain of empires, a baton passed from one dominant power to the next. For the last 80 years, that power has had one name: the United States. Whether directly or indirectly, every major economy on Earth has been shaped by American influence. Its money, its markets, its technology, its decisions. No country truly stood apart. But lately, things feel different. Uncertainty, disparity, instability. We see the headlines, we feel the consequences. But underneath it all, something bigger is happening. We're watching the collapse of an economic balance that held the world together for decades. But if you cut through the noise, if you get to the core of how global power actually works, you'll always find the same four forces shaping the game. They're the pillars of global economic power, and whoever controls them writes the rules. The first is monetary power and financial influence. Then follows industrial production and global supply chains, access to raw materials and energy resources. And finally, technological leadership and innovation. These pillars don't operate in isolation. They're deeply connected. Finance fuels innovation. Innovation transforms industry. Industry depends on energy. And energy is always tied to money. Real power isn't just having one pillar. It's knowing how to balance them all. Because when that balance breaks, the whole system shifts. The global order we know today was built around these four forces. But it's being reshaped right now as each pillar becomes contested. The United States is still the most powerful economic force in the world. But if we want to understand where this instability is taking us, we have to go back. Back to the moment the modern world was born. After World War II, the world lay in ruins. Cities bombed out, industries shattered, economies on their knees. Except for one, the United States. It was the only major economy left standing in the world. By 1945, America controlled about 75% of the world's gold reserves. It had the only currency the world still trusted, and that changed everything. In 1944, as the war was nearing its end, 44 nations gathered in a small town in New Hampshire, Bretton Woods. There, they agreed on something monumental. The world needed stability, trust, and a foundation for rebuilding, and so they made a choice. The US dollar would become the world's primary reserve currency, backed by gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This wasn't just symbolic. It meant that every currency was now pegged to the dollar, and the dollar itself was backed by physical gold held in American vaults. This wasn't just symbolic. It meant that every currency was now pegged to the dollar, and the dollar itself was backed by physical gold held in American vaults. The US had just claimed one of the four pillars that define who rules the global economy: the monetary power. In the years that followed, this system reshaped the global financial order. The dollar became the benchmark for trade, for investment, for debt. Every country in the world needed dollars to move money across borders, and that demand was constant. This unique position gave the United States an incredible advantage. It could print more dollars to fuel its economy. And unlike other nations, it didn't need to worry about inflation in the same way. Why? Because even as more dollars flooded the world, every country still wanted them. At the same time, America could issue massive amounts of government debt and still be seen as a safe bet. US Treasury bonds became the gold standard of global investment, reliable, stable, and backed by the most powerful economy on Earth. With this monetary dominance locked in, capital from around the world flowed into the United States, into its industries, into its innovation, into its future. While Europe struggled to rebuild from the ashes of war, the Soviet Union remained closed off behind the Iron Curtain, and China was locked in the chaos of Maoist revolution, the United States surged ahead. Fueled by an unprecedented flow of global capital and a government deeply committed to its industrial base, America emerged as the undisputed manufacturing superpower. By the 1950s, it was producing nearly half of the world's industrial output. Detroit became the beating heart of this new industrial empire. The Big Three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, weren't just American icons. Together, they built 80% of the world's cars. U.S. factories ran day and night, powering a booming middle class with millions of well-paid jobs. American steel, led by giants like U.S. Steel, dominated the global market. In chemicals and plastics, companies like DuPont and ExxonMobil revolutionized entire sectors, laying the foundation for modern materials. At this point, the United States didn't just control the world's money, it was the world's factory. It built the machines, the cars, the infrastructure, the energy systems. And with its massive investments in research and development, the U.S. quickly became the global hub of technological innovation too. Two more pillars were now firmly in American hands: industrial production and innovation. By the 1950s, the United States didn't just control the money. It didn't just dominate global production or lead the world in innovation. It controlled also the fuel that powered it all. The American industrial machine was built on an extraordinary advantage: abundant access to raw materials. From steel to copper, aluminum to iron, the U.S. had direct and indirect control over the resources that mattered most. The oil, above all, was everything, through what would later be called the Seven Sisters, a group of U.S. and British oil giants like Royal Dutch Shell and Standard Oil. America held influence over more than 90% of the world's oil reserves, excluding only the Soviet bloc. But oil was just one piece of the puzzle. The great mining regions of Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia, rich in the materials modern industry depended on, were largely under the control of colonial empires still tied to Europe. And in the post-war world, Europe needed America more than ever. Thanks to the Marshall Plan, a massive U.S. aid program that helped rebuild war-torn economies, Washington gained immense influence over its allies, and by extension, their colonial supply chains. In other words, raw materials flowed where American interest pointed. Resources from Congo, Chile, Ghana, and beyond. Fueled American factories, powered American cars, and armed American dominance. At this point, all four pillars of global economic power were concentrated in the hands of a single country: currency, industry, resources, innovation. And with that, the United States wasn't just a superpower. It was the center of the global economy. But American dominance was never without its challenges. Even while the U.S. held the crown, the world around it was already starting to change. By the late 1960s, the golden era of American economic supremacy began to show its first fractures. Decades of rapid industrial growth, massive defense spending, especially in Vietnam, and ambitious domestic programs had one thing in common: they were expensive. To sustain it all, the U.S. printed more and more dollars, but in a system still technically tied to gold, this came at a cost. Nations like France and Germany, wary of America's rising debt, began converting their dollars back into gold, draining U.S. reserves at an alarming rate. By 1971, the pressure became unsustainable. President Richard Nixon took a dramatic step. He suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators.
For the first time since World War II, one of the four pillars of U.S. dominance, its financial system, was no longer untouchable. The dollar was still important, but the guarantee behind it was gone, and the world noticed. But the troubles didn't stop there. While the U.S. tried to stabilize its economy, a quiet revolution was taking place across the world. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, waves of independence movements swept through Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Nations that had long been under colonial rule, and whose natural resources had fueled Western industries, began reclaiming control. Oil, copper, bauxite, uranium. Suddenly, these were no longer under the hands of Western corporations. Countries like Algeria, Libya, Zaire, and Indonesia began nationalizing their resources, cutting deep into the invisible supply chains that had long powered the American industrial machine. And so, while one pillar of U.S. power was shaken from the top, the dollar, another began to erode from below: access to cheap global resources. The cracks were forming, and America was no longer the only player in the game. But all of a sudden, a new shockwave was about to hit, and it came from the Middle East. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War erupts. A coalition led by Egypt and Syria launches a surprise attack on Israel, aiming to reclaim territories lost just a few years earlier, including the Sinai Peninsula. The United States, unwavering in its support for Israel, steps in, and the Arab world responds. The OPEC nations impose a devastating oil embargo on the West. The price of oil doesn't just rise, it quadruples. Overnight, the American economy is shaken to its core. Industries built on cheap oil suddenly face soaring costs. Factories slow down, inflation spirals, the age of easy energy is over. But in the shadows of this crisis, something extraordinary happens. In 1974, President Richard Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger broker a secret deal with Saudi Arabia. The terms? Saudi Arabia agrees to sell its oil exclusively in US dollars. In return, the US offers military protection and privileged access to Western financial markets. But the deal doesn't stop there. The Saudis, and eventually other OPEC nations, agree to reinvest their oil profits into US Treasury bonds. In other words, oil money starts financing American debt. And with that single move, the United States re-engineers the global economy. Anyone who wants to buy oil now has to buy dollars first. The petrodollar is born. In one strategic pivot, the U.S. silences doubts about the strength of its currency, reasserts control over global energy markets, and turns oil into a vehicle for dollar dominance. American industry stabilizes, but something even bigger is about to happen. What happened in that moment gave the American economy the oxygen it desperately needed. And it was during those very years that one sector began to explode: finance. Finance becomes the new frontier of American power. In the late 70s and into the 80s, New York rises as the undisputed capital of global finance. Wall Street isn't just where money is made, it's where the world goes to access capital. The US no longer needs to produce everything it consumes. It can borrow, invest, speculate. The dollar is the king. Wall Street is the palace. And the American economy becomes more financialized with each passing year. The new era brings with it fresh capital, flowing from oil profits, debt markets, and a booming financial sector. And that capital goes somewhere: into innovation. The 1980s and 1990s become the golden age of American technological ambition. With Wall Street backing bold ideas, a new generation of companies is born. Lean, experimental, and ready to change the world. Silicon Valley transforms from a niche hardware hub into the epicenter of global tech. Computers become personal. Software eats the world. And then the internet happens. Fueled by decades of financial dominance, America becomes not just a market leader, but a technology superpower. Companies like Microsoft, Intel, and later Amazon don't just shape markets, they reshape society itself. Up to this point, everything seems unstoppable, but beneath the surface, America's incredible prosperity came with a cost. As wealth spread across the middle class, labor became more expensive, and slowly the country began to change. What had once been the world's greatest industrial engine started to shut down. Factories moved overseas, jobs vanished, and a pillar of American power, its industrial base, began to crumble. The United States, once the world's factory, it was now becoming the world's consumer. It shifted from producing goods to importing them, and in doing so gave up another sphere of influence: control over natural resources. As former colonies gained independence, resource-rich nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America began to manage their own raw materials, reducing America's grip on the global flow of commodities. In just a few decades, two of the four pillars that had once defined U.S. dominance, industrial production and resource control, began slipping out of its hands. And while America was outsourcing its factories, something was happening on the other side of the world. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping rises to power in China, and he sees it clearly. If China is to grow, it needs to change everything. For the first time, a communist country embraces capitalist economics. The doors open, foreign investment flows in, and China becomes an emerging industrial hub, powered by cheap labor and massive ambition. By the 1990s, the shift is unstoppable. Western multinationals, American, European, Japanese, begin producing in China, drawn by low costs and high efficiency. In 2001, China joins the World Trade Organization, gaining full access to global markets. From that moment on, China can export to the world with virtually no restrictions. In just over 40 years, China goes from isolated nation to global production powerhouse. It becomes the largest industrial economy on Earth and the world's top exporter. One of the four great pillars, the same one that had once built American supremacy, now belonged to China. China's rise in recent decades is fresh in everyone's memory. We don't need to revisit the industrial boom, the demographic explosion, the real estate frenzy, or even the technological acceleration. What matters now is where China stands today. This is no longer just a country catching up. China has reached the frontier, and in some areas, it has already overtaken the United States. Tech giants like Tencent, Baidu, and Alibaba have built digital ecosystems that rival and sometimes outpace their Western counterparts. They've done this inside a single market of over 1 billion people. Today, China isn't just competing in tech. In many fields from social media to AI, from EVs to e-commerce, it's leading. TikTok, born in China, dominates Western screens. DeepSeek and other AI challengers threaten to disrupt American tech supremacy. BYD is now outselling legacy automakers in the global electric vehicle race. And for the first time, China is on the verge of claiming one of the four pillars of global economic power, technological innovation.
Tomorrow, the United States will implement reciprocal tariffs on other nations.
What's happening today, Trump imposing global tariffs, especially against China, is not just a sudden move. It's the direct consequence of what has unfolded over the past 80 years. The Trump administration is, quite frankly, desperately trying to bring American industry back to its former glory, the glory of the 1970s and 80s, even at a high cost. And to do it, they're turning back to the original source of American power, the dollar. The same dollar that was used to respond to Putin's invasion of Ukraine by sanctioning oligarchs, freezing assets, and blocking transactions through the SWIFT banking system, which, not by coincidence, remains tightly under American influence thanks to the dollar's dominance. On the other side, the developments we're seeing today in China and across the developing world also have deep roots in the same four pillars. For years now, the BRICS nations have been working on a common currency, a way to free themselves from the grip of the dollar. China, for example, has signed deals with Saudi Arabia to buy oil in yuan rather than dollars, reducing its dependence on the American currency. At the same time, China is likely offloading U.S. Treasury bonds, once the core of its foreign reserves, while ramping up its holdings of gold. What will happen in the next few years, it's hard to predict. But what is clear is that the next decade will be marked by a powerful sense of economic uncertainty. Because when two giants, the U.S. and China, become so large that they can't help but collide, they end up competing directly across all four major economic spheres. And the consequences of that kind of collision are disruptive. They ripple out from the highest levels of the economy down to something much more personal. Consequences that will eventually touch the daily lives of all of us. Thanks for staying with us this far. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. See you next time on Vision Economy.